Hi, so today we're going to continue with Chapter 12 on the central nervous system. We discussed in Chapter 11 the tissues of the nervous system as well as the different supportive cells, right, along with the neurons. So now we're going to get into structures of the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord are the two main organs of the central nervous system. The adult brains have four regions: cerebral hemispheres, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. And in Chapter 12, we're going to go over all of these structures in detail and give you a little bit of information about them. This graphic tells you a little bit about the development of the human brain, starting with what's called the neural tube on the left. And then you see we're starting to get our primary brain vesicles and then secondary brain vesicles, and then it folds up into the brain structure that you see here. Now, this is the adult pattern. The four main regions of cerebral hemispheres in beige, diencephalon in purple, brainstem in green, and cerebellum in sort of that deeper brown are the four regions of the adult brain. Now, the adult brain is arranged in a specific way. So we have gray matter, which is the neuron cell bodies and some short non-myelinated neurons. Then we have the white matter, and the white matter is myelinated and non-myelinated axons only. So when we think about a neuron, remember that it has sort of that round body with all of those extensions. And the cell bodies are in the gray matter, and the axons are in the white matter. And so this is the basic pattern that's found throughout the central nervous system. There is, if you see the cut through the spinal cord, we have a central cavity, inner gray matter, and then the white matter on the outside. And it's going to be a little bit different in the brain, because in the brain, we start getting additional gray matter. So notice here we have an inner gray matter. We have some other sort of little groupings of gray matter along the brain stem. And when we get all the way up to the cortex, you'll notice it has a couple of brain nuclei gray matter and then an outer cortex of gray matter. So we have cell bodies in a couple of different places. All right, so we have the neurons, we have the brain tissue itself. We also have what are called ventricles, and ventricles are fluid-filled chambers that are continuous with one another and to the central canal. And what is the ventricle for? The ventricles are to support the brain from within. They're filled with fluid on the inside. The brain is surrounded by fluid on the outside, and it allows the brain to float in the skull. This graphic here tells you all about the different ventricles and where they are. And so when you think about the ventricles, there are four of them, right? Two lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. So this, as you can see, if it's filled with fluid up on the inside of the brain, sort of supports the brain. The brain is very soft tissue, and so it's very delicate. So to float it from the inside as well as the outside is important. All right, so the cerebral hemispheres are about 83% of the brain. When we talk about the cerebral hemispheres, there are different types of surface markings. We have ridges, we have grooves, we have fissures, sulci, and they're all going to separate the different regions of the brain. They also serve as little landmarks for what's happening, little functional regions of the brain. This is a picture of the brain on the left-hand side with the cerebral veins attached, and on the right-hand side without. You'll notice there are a couple of lobes named. We have 5 lobes of our brain that are named. 4 of them are named for the bones that overlay them. So frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and on the up inside is called the insula. So here you can see that there are fissures and things that separate the different lobes of the brain. All right, this animation will show you, you can click on it, can show you different, it's the rotatable brain, and it's going to give you a good 5 minutes of different brain regions. So you can click on that if you'd like. So here's a cartoon version, and again, there are different sulci and fissures and things that divide the different regions of the brain. These two probes are looking at the insula of the brain. So when we divide the lobes of the brain, the central sulcus divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The parieto-occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe from occipital. The lateral sulcus outlines the temporal lobe. So these are different areas, the regions that sort of divide the cerebral hemispheres. And again, each hemisphere has the cortex, the white matter, and the basal nuclei, which are again another gray matter. All right, and this gives you a little bit more detail with the transverse cerebral fissure, the parieto-occipital sulcus, etc. So the cerebral cortex is the executive suite of the brain: conscious mind, awareness, sensory perception, things like that. Very thin layer of gray matter. So when we think of the cortex, we think of that outer gray matter. But it's 40% of the mass of the brain, even though it's a very thin layer. So that's because if the cortex is gray, the gray has the cell bodies, the glial cells, blood vessels, all of that. So it has a lot more mass than the myelinated axons. Remembering that myelin is that insulated covering. If we want to talk about sort of the cerebral cortex, we have three types of functional areas. Each hemisphere is contralateral, which means the right side of my brain controls the left side of my body. The left side of my brain controls the right side of the body. Lateralization of cortical function only occurs in one hemisphere, right? Specialized cortical functions can occur on one of both sides. So the motor areas, when we think about how the brain is arranged, the pink is going to be generally a motor area or an association area, and the red. The blues are going to be our sensory input areas. And so you can see how the frontal lobe is really concerned with motor. The primary motor cortex is all about muscle movement. The premotor cortex is about the motor skills that we've learned through repetition or behavior. We don't have to think about them. Then we have all of the pink area. You'll see spatial tasks, task management, object recall, all kinds of things in the pink area. If you go to the back part of the brain, right, we have our sensory areas. And if you read down the sides, somatic means touch, then taste, balance and equilibrium, vision, and hearing. We have all of our sensory areas in the posterior part of our cerebral cortex. And this is just going to give you some information about the different regions of the cerebral cortex. The primary somatic motor, right, that is a movement, precentral gyrus, right, control of precise, skilled skeletal muscle movement. This gives you a picture of the sensory map of the postcentral gyrus and the motor map of the precentral gyrus. So on that gyrus, which is the primary motor cortex, the movement of all of those things starts inside the longitudinal fissure and goes down and around. You can see we don't have a lot of brain control for the foot and the knee, but look at what a big portion of the brain is involved in working our hands, our face, and our mouth, right? Because that's fine motor movement, all right? Same thing on the other side. We have a lot of sensory in our foot. Look at that big giant foot, right? Because we walk and need to make sure that we're walking safe. Knee, leg, hip, not so much. But again, elbow, forearm, hand, and then look at all the sensory that's devoted to the face, the teeth, the tongue, and the abdomen. Right? So the sensory map and the motor map of each one of the gyri. All right, the premotor cortex learned repetitive, sequential. All right, Broca's area, motor speech area, the frontal eye field, voluntary eye movements. All right, so notice how that's all in the front of the brain. All right, this gets us a little bit to inside of the brain. So we start going towards things that are the association areas. So look at the processes, emotions related to personal and social interaction. On the back, the visual association area, the somatosensory association complex. And these are going to give meaning to sensory information that is brought in from a variety of different pieces of information, either visually or hearing, and we're going to sort of make sense of it. All right, this is a clinical homeostatic imbalance slide. So what happens when we have damage to the brain? So damage to the areas of the primary motor cortex is going to paralyze those muscles. And so it's showing you how an effect on the brain will affect the actual body. All right, our sensory areas, primary somatosensory, which we've already talked about. All right, again, the body map for each one. And then we're back to the association cortex. Again, integrating sensory input from touch to get an understanding of the object, the size, the texture, the relationship. Right, when you reach into your pocket and try to pull out a penny, right, you're going to look. You're going to use your hand. You're not looking at it, so you're using your hand to feel the size and the depth and the thickness to determine that it's a penny. We have visual, primary visual areas, visual association areas. Anything that's an association area is interpreting stimuli and comparing it to something you already did before. So the visual association area, right? Recognize a face or pick something out, know what something is when you look at it. From an auditory standpoint, right, that's hearing, interprets information as pitch, loudness, location, and then the association area stores memories and sounds, so you know, oh, I've heard this before, or something like that. Vestibular cortex is about balance, right? Where your head is. If you close your eyes, you still know that your head is left and right because of your vestibular cortex. The olfactory is smell. Gustatory is taste. The visceral sensory area lets you know that something's going on in your, usually digestive tract. Upset stomach, full bladder, something like that. You're hungry. All right, so this is the, the same thing that we've been looking at, right? But now you're kind of getting a better idea of what each one of these things do and how they're related to each other. So, damage to the visual association area is different than damage to the primary visual cortex, right? If you're going to damage the primary cortex, you can't see. But if you damage the visual association area, you're not really sure what you're looking at. You're like, what is that? I don't know what that is. So those are two different regions of the brain. And then we get to what are called the multimodal association areas. These are going to be for planning and consciousness, things like recognizing patterns for a complete understanding. We have an anterior association area of the prefrontal cortex, posterior association area, which is sort of located in the parietal and occipital lobes, and then the limbic system, which we'll get to in a minute. So the prefrontal cortex, intellect, cognition, recall, personality, judgment, reasoning, right? And if we look and see where that is, right, it's going to be again up in this pink area, anterior association area. The posterior, right, recognizing faces, localizing us in space. Where are you? Understanding the written and spoken language. So if we go back to the brain, see that Wernicke's area outlined with the dashed line, right? That's the written and spoken language area. The limbic system is really interesting because the limbic system is would be our emotional brain, and it provides that emotional impact that makes it important to us. So if it doesn't provide that little boost, then we generally don't remember it. If we do remember it, it's because it was super happy or super sad or super exciting. That's what the limbic system does. All right, so tumors, right? Tumor are brain lesions in the anterior association area may cause personality disorders. And so again, these are just little clinical inputs that will help you to kind of put what we're learning into some kind of perspective. Lateralization of cortical functioning. It means that each hemisphere is not identical, right? The right side does something and the left side does something. Usually people are cerebral dominant. Most human beings are left side dominant. Usually results in right-handedness. In the rest of us, it's 10 and left-handedness. And so the left hemisphere controls math and language and logic. And the right hemisphere controls visual, spatial, intuition, and motion. And so you can have sort of a predominance of one or the other depending on which side dominant you are. Of course, they communicate, right? And they integrate, but you will definitely have one that's stronger than the other. All of that we just talked about was the little thin layer of gray cortex on the outside of the brain. If we start to go a little bit deeper in the cerebral hemispheres, we get to the white matter. And the white matter is about communicating between the sides of the brain and communicating between the brain and the body. It contains myelinated fibers, that's why it's white. And we can have association, we can have commissural, or we can have projection fibers. And each of these fibers do something different. Association fibers connect the same hemisphere. Commissural fibers connect the gray matter of the two hemispheres. And the projection fibers connect the brain to the spinal cord and then to the body. So we have association fibers in the same, commissural fibers across, and projection fibers top down. Right, and you can see those here. Right, we have the reddish orange ones are association fibers, and you can see how those are connecting different regions of the same hemisphere. Then you can see the green ones are going between hemispheres, corpus callosum, fornix, and then the purple ones start the brain and go down into the medulla and then the spinal cord. And again, so everything can talk to each other. It's the side view of the same thing, right? The association fibers in the same hemisphere. The commissural fibers look like dots because it's showing you the fibers going in and out, and the purple fibers going from the brain down into the spinal cord. Then just deep to that, so we had the gray matter, the white matter, and now we're into the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei have a shape that looks very similar to the ventricles of the brain, right? The basal nuclei sort of include the caudate nucleus, the putamen, right? And it sort of has that sort of roundish shape. What's the point, right? We're not exactly sure, but they're thinking it's involved in influencing muscle movements, playing a role in cognition, intensity of movement, incorrect or inappropriate responses, inhibiting. So it's sort of a control system for what's going on. Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease are disorders of the basal nuclei, and both have a symptom of rapid or inappropriate movements, right? Too much shaking or that kind of thing. So that's where the functions sort of come from. When people have an issue with them, what happens? All right, the diencephalon is the next region of the brain, not the cerebrum. The diencephalon is that purple region. It has three paired structures, gray matter, so that means cell bodies, thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. All three are enclosed the third ventricle. And again, you can look at this rotatable brain, right? Give yourself a picture of the diencephalon, which is this whole purple area here. It's amazing that I'm just doing chapter 12 and I didn't realize that I could use my pointer to point things out to you. Wow, okay. So again, these are the cerebral hemispheres, and this is the diencephalon. The thalamus is this, the epithalamus is this little region here, and the hypothalamus is this region here. And each of these three regions have specific functions. This is the same kind of thing, right? Thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus, just without the color. So we'll be here without the color. So the thalamus is first, right? This purple sort of oval is actually a conglomerate, egg-shaped, that have several nuclei that each are named for their location: ventral anterior, ventral lateral, ventral posterior lateral. They're just named by where they are. And what's the point of the thalamus? The point of the thalamus is to act as a relay station for information that comes into the cortex. It's going to decide, does the brain need to know all of this, or does the brain not need to know all of this? Because 90% of the time you are not aware of the temperature or background noise or other things. You're sort of focused on one thing. Well, the thalamus decides if you need to know about it. Mediates sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. It just sort of determines what we need to know and what we don't need to know. Because if the brain was flooded with all the information that it needs to know every day, right, they think that has a link to autism. Where people are just completely overstimulated with their clothing and the temperature and noise, and they're getting all the information. So it's kind of an interesting little set of nuclei. So just below that, right, in this little area here, so the thalamus is going to be here, the hypothalamus is down here. We have more nuclei. And again, they're named for where they are: lateral, posterior, dorsomedial, anterior, right, named for where they are. The hypothalamus is really, really important in terms of being the main visceral control center. Homeostasis, autonomic nervous system, blood pressure, heart rate, digestive tract, pupil size, body temperature, hunger, water balance, sleep wake. All of that happens in the hypothalamus, sort of our homeostatic control center. Right? If we have hypothalamic disturbances, right, these things can happen. We have the epithalamus, kind of a small little something. The most important thing that it has is the pineal gland. Pineal gland is this little gland in the back that secretes melatonin for our sleep-wake cycle. So that's the epithalamus, sort of posterior diencephalon. All right, so here we have that thalamus, that switchboard. Information comes up from the body, and this decides, do I tell the cortex or do I not? Right here, this is the homeostatic control center, and then the epithalamus back here with the pineal gland that secretes that melatonin. This is a picture of the brain stem. So now we're down into the third major brain region, right? The green. So we have from the side, this is the midbrain, this little band is the pons, and this is the medulla. In this picture, the midbrain would be up here, the pons would be right here, and the medulla would be right here. They control the survival behaviors, meaning give you a heart rate, give you a visual reflex, auditory reflex, right? Where am I? Right, the breathing rhythm, right, particular formation. So the brainstem is involved in sort of the basal life-giving functions of the brain. Then the medulla, right? Here we are at the very base of the brain stem, equilibrium, right? And again, all of this area here is heart rate and breathing and reflexes and sort of our basic life-giving functions. This moderates that by what information do we need to know, right? How do we interpret it? And then the brain will be up there making decisions. The last little guy we're going to talk about is this little clump, and this is called the cerebellum. Oh, guess not. The medulla. Sorry, cerebellum's next. Autonomic reflexes. Again, heart contraction, blood vessel diameter, vomiting, swallowing, hiccup, coughing, sneezing, right? Things that we need to do to basically stay alive. The cerebellum, 11% of the brain mass. It's about coordinating movement, plays a role in balance. So we want to, anything that the body needs to do, the cerebellum is going to be there to sort of say, okay, how much pressure, how much force, right, do we need to put on this certain activity. There's a thin cortex of gray matter with a little white matter on the inside, right? So you can see these trees right here. It's called the arbor vitae or arbor vitae, arbor vitae. And this is the white matter, and you can see how those go up and they're connected. And then the gray matter on the outside. Again, here, white matter, gray matter, cerebellum. Notice how they're connected-ish right behind the pons in the brainstem. So the cerebellum sort of initiates voluntary muscle contraction, receives the signals, and just lets the cerebellum know like where we are, coordinate smooth muscle contraction, right? So it's all about fine-tuning that motor activity. This is a little bit of a picture of the anterior and posterior lobe of the cerebellum and how where in the cerebellum controls what body part. Oh, end of chapter 12a, and there is a part B. So I will see you at part B.